Welcome to the herd and thanks for listening. If you enjoy this sodcast, please like it, share it, give it a good rating, and follow, and help more people find their way into the ruminati herd. If you have suggestions for improvements, please let me know. Howdy, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Meet Your Herdmates sodcast. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Chad Ellis, currently with the Texas Agricultural Lands Trust, and he's joining us from Lone, Texas. Thank you.
Yes.
You gave me and then I said something else, and I shouldn't do that. So the heart of Texas.
That's correct. Yeah.
So
well, thanks. Go ahead. No, go please, Peter.
So for reference, for people, I know everybody should know where Lone, Texas is, but where exactly is it?
Yeah, so I mean, Lone, if you looked at on a map of Texas, right in the dead center, we're kind of located in the northern part of McCulloch County, right in the heart of Texas.
But it's not spelled like Lone Star.
No, it's Lohn. So it's easy to. We many times people pronounce it lawn, Texas, and we always say here in Texas, that there is a lawn, Texas, just outside Abilene. So it gets a little confusing, and that's just not too far down the road itself. So, but it's a great place to be, and a great place to have been raised, and a great community.
So, great big graduating class at your high school.
Yeah, that is correct. So I graduated. It's a big class of 4, Peter, and I know you're already laughing. And I was the top 25% of the class, just so if you're wondering. No. So yeah, we had 85 students, K through 12. I think they're pretty close to right about 100 students today. And so it's a great, again, we're a small farm and ranch community, all based around agriculture.
Jump ahead just a little bit, but how has Lone changed from when you were in high school to today?
No, yeah, that's a great question. And I think, if we look at the landscape across rural America, not just here in Lone, not here locally, we see a lot of challenges. And, I think some of the main challenges that we're facing is the economic challenge in our rural America of just being able to stay viable as a community. When we think about it, and I'm a prime example, right? You grow up, you graduate, you go off to college. Well, there's not really a place to go work and move back home in a lot of places. Or, if it's to move back to the farm or ranch, a lot of our farm and ranches can only, really support one family. So you have to kind of, go off and kind of bite your teeth off into something else. And maybe, down the road, you can make it back home. And so, I think those are a lot of challenges, and it's a lot of challenges we face, across rural America, across our landscapes, not just here. And I think too, it's kind of been interesting. We kind of sit here and think we're in the middle of this pandemic, Peter, and there's, I think, extra pressures in a lot of cases in our rural America that I've seen here in the last 9 months. And just talking to other friends across the country, we're seeing the same thing. One of the things that we're seeing, Peter, is that people are realizing they don't have to sit behind a desk, in a glass high rise in, downtown Dallas or Austin or Houston or Chicago, wherever you may live. And they're realizing that, with technologies today, that we can sit here and have a conversation as we are today on a podcast of, educating and informing folks, from me sitting here in Lone and you back home. And so what we're seeing is, I think, actually an added pressure, and that we're seeing more lands even being broke up. People want to be part of the land. I think that's, I think historically we could kind of really get philosophical about how the America was formed. It was about, owning land and farming and these kind of components. And I think people realize they can get to their roots. Peter, I think we're seeing this dynamic. We're seeing more and more pressures on our rural landscapes of being fragmented.
Yeah.
People realize that they can, own a little piece of property and get outside and enjoy it. And, there's so many, mental and human health reasons why that's great. But at the same time, there's pressures of, we need this land, to be able to provide, this food, fiber, and all these other ecosystem services of clean water and all of that, and that stewardship component. So we have some challenges ahead of us, and I know that as a community, we'll come together and find solutions to some of these new challenges.
So your bachelor's degree was natural resource management, right?
That's right.
And you had a career goal, but you kind of had to reevaluate. What's the story with you and a game warden?
Yeah. So growing up, kind of where I did, hunting and fishing, it was every day. And enjoy it. It's a huge passion of mine. And, because really hunting is conservation. That's the thing. I definitely have this, land ethic and conservation ethic in me, and it's part of my DNA. And so I went to Sul Ross, kind of far west Texas, kind of in the Big Bend area of Texas, and went really there originally. My thoughts was I was, determined, Peter, that I wanted to be a game warden because just the wildlife in that aspect. And my first semester in school, I took a wildlife law, and a game warden taught that class. And I got probably about halfway through that class, Peter, and it realized this game warden deal is it's great and it sounds great, but the busy time of the year is during hunting season or fishing season, and these guys are out actually working and aren't getting to hunt and fish and those type of things. I was like, well, I got to shift that. And so I kind of moved in more of the wildlife biology, natural resource management side.
We've already touched on a couple things that I want to come back to, but you've worked in a number of advisory and counseling roles with ranchers over the years, farmers and ranchers, I guess, to make it broad. So you work for NRCS, you work for the Noble Foundation, and what sorts of things have you learned by working with those people and their families and their operations?
Yeah, I mean, Peter, one thing I've been very blessed and just my experience. So as you mentioned, I worked for Natural Resource Conservation Service, and kind of that arm of USDA that's really to help those private landowners and managers. Worked all over Texas, worked in Florida for a number of years, and then worked at the regional office and kind of worked all over the country. So I've had, pretty well, I've almost worked in every state and worked with producers across the country. And one thing I've learned is that, I think our land managers across the country are undervalued into the community of really what all they do and what they provide. I think that's one thing I've learned. And then the other thing is that just like people, we're all different, and the resources we manage are different. And especially every ranch and farm has its own uniqueness, as we are as individuals. And it really starts with the soil, and that's really the DNA of those operations, right? I guess my goal before going to school and wanting to be a game warden was, I wanted to be, when I was younger, I always use the analogy of NBA player, right? But I'm 5'7". That the chances of, the potential of that are very slim to none, pretty much none. But I enjoyed basketball, and I think that's one of the things I've found is that we have to really get in tuned and understand our land and what's the potential of our land, of what it can really provide, and make sure that land actually, follows into our goals and objectives as land managers. I've run across a number of people across the country, especially I would say new landowners that have a goal and objectives, and they fall in love with the piece of property and say, hey, this is my goal and objective. And, unfortunately, the property that they bought will never meet, those goals and objectives. And it's sad in some sense that it just doesn't match up. So I think that those are some of the key things I've noticed across the country.
I spoke to one gentleman recently who taught me that they're growing bananas in Iceland.
Wow.
So you can, if you have the resources, and they have very cheap electrical power, but again, you do those things, and then nature has a way of, the way I put it is nature votes last. So you can do whatever you want, and then there'll be the response, and then you get to deal with it. Two important points, I think, is one is the role of profitability in any sustainable conversation or conversation about sustainability. And then the second is what you just touched on, which is the role of private land owners in conservation. Now, where I live, we have a lot of public land. Other states have more than Oregon, but it's a reality here. I don't think that's a reality in Texas, is it?
Right. We're pretty much a privately, owned land or operation. 91% is privately owned. About 83% is actually working lands or ranches and farms in Texas. So there are a little bit of public lands, but the majority is private.
And so those privately owned lands are supporting wildlife there. You mentioned ecosystem services, and that's a concept I think more people need to understand, is that proper managed range, ranch, grassland, however we want to define it, ruminant animal agriculture provides a lot more than meat and milk and byproducts from the animals.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think that's kind of the bigger dialogue, Peter, and is, I think, every day and sort of the conversations we just had is that, people are further and further removed from agriculture. And that's just how things are, right? And understanding what these lands provide and ecosystem, goods and services, right? And we automatically think of, food and fiber and those things, but they provide so much more, of clean water, clean air, open space, all of these things that we take for granted. And I think that's the thing, is and why I mentioned that I think farmers and ranchers are underappreciated, because they're stewarding this land and providing these goods and services, not just for their families, but for all of us, right? Through the whole community. I mean, we talk about community collaboration. I mean, that's it. It's the definition of what these producers are providing. And so, I think we have to have a connection. I think more and more people are wanting to know where their food comes from, and want to know that those animals are taken care of, that land's taken care of. And I think we have great opportunities to kind of help bridge some of that gap and really bring that private land stewardship to that public benefit. And that's the thing that we promote. Some recent studies that just came out this year, Peter, and I don't know if you've had a chance to see this. It was from actually based out of California. So there's a recent research project that just came out of our counterpart of Texas Agricultural Land Trust, of the California Rangeland Trust, and Berkeley. And what they did was looking at the value of ecosystem services. So what they did, Peter, was looked at all of these things, right? These lists of all of these goods and benefits that the California Rangeland Trust has under easement and what that's providing, to the community of California. And they're roughly around 300,000 acres is what they have under easement in California. And those 300,000 acres is providing $1.4 billion worth annually to the state of California of these ecosystem services. And so it's amazing to kind of think about that and talk about a return on investment when we think about easements or conservation and some of these components. And I think we've lost that dialogue. So I've just recently started a study with Texas A&M of us looking at the same, typical methodology of looking at what are the values in Texas and those aspects beyond just food and fiber and things of that nature. So it's pretty amazing to kind of start thinking about.
And of course, I'll pull out my soapbox and put it on the ground and step up on top of it and say that most of our conversations have yet to fully incorporate what the research in metabolic health and the role of animal source foods plays in promoting health and thereby lowering the burden of chronic disease and the ecological footprint, if you will, of chronic disease and the healthcare. I mean, the story will get better and better as we get better and better at telling about it. And unfortunately, to a certain extent, we're always playing catch up because people can make claims. And then if the data doesn't exist, we've got to go study and accumulate the data and then present the data. And unfortunately, we're too often dealing with people that don't deal with data. They deal with something else. So no, I had not heard of that. And I would love to have a link to it and include that in notes as well as just learn myself. So you've talked about easements and you work for the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. Describe what the Texas Agricultural Land Trust is about and what you mean by easements.
Sure.
What's the purpose? And also maybe start with another piece of your family history, which is the loss of your grandfather's ranch through a claim.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's, again, it's about, this private land stewardship, public benefit, and the connectivity of it all. Texas Agricultural Land Trust, we're really about conserving our Texas heritage of agricultural lands, wildlife habitat, and natural resources. We're really about trying to keep working lands working for the benefit, not only for those families, but for all Texans and really beyond. And it kind of comes back into these ecosystem services and these components. And so it's really important for us to think of, just the dynamics of our increased population, right? Is increasing, and that brings on its own challenges, health, challenges, all of these things, it's very, when we think about the subject, it's very complex and there's a lot of components and it's very much a systems and a linkage from one thing to the other. A little bit of history, kind of step back a little bit is my grandfather, ranched in kind of central Texas as well. And back in the early 50s, we had a lot of areas in these communities where the Corps of Engineers came in and built, lakes and things for water resources, as well as for flooding control back to the towns. And that, kind of happened across, all of the U.S. And so, unfortunately for him, he ended up where the piece of property and the ranch that he had ended up being overlaid over into a lake that's still there today. So had some of this eminent domain components of basically having to sell, and it kind of became. And he was, in his 50s, well in his 50s at that time. And so it's kind of this deal of, what do I do? And so just sort of those dynamics. And so it's, I've heard those stories growing up, and it's become very passionate to me of how do we, keep families on the land and providing, all of these benefits for us. And so that's one thing that really brought me to the Texas Agricultural Land Trust is the mission of keeping working lands working. One of our bread and butter tools, Peter, is a easement, which easement is basically, the easiest way to say it. It's a real estate transaction in a sense, right? So on an easement, you can basically donate or purchase development rights off those ranches, and it helps that family kind of keep the operation intact. It keeps that development aspects, and it keeps those working lands working. And so that's one of our main tools, but we're also working on trying to keep adding tools to the toolbox to help empower the producer. And some of those are looking at these ecosystem service markets. So being able to try to help pay for carbon sequestration, water quality, biodiversity, some of these ecosystem services that we've already discussed.
Excellent. So development pressure, I have had a couple of occasions to drive up and down the Front Range of Colorado. And you see a lot of land that once was agricultural land that now has been developed into subdivisions and whatever the right description is. And in Colorado, apparently you can sell water rights separate from the land. And in many cases, the water becomes more valuable than the land itself. And then the development takes place. So obviously that land never comes back to agriculture. It tends to occur on productive lands, so not so much on the marginal lands, although to a certain extent. And then, of course, if you're farming and now you're surrounded by this, even though your land hasn't been developed, the pressures become so great that it's almost impossible to resist or to continue farming. And so this, again, is something I think too few people recognize when we talk about loss of agricultural lands due to erosion, degradation, but development is a huge pressure that needs to be included in there as well.
Yeah, most definitely. I think those are, there is a lot of pressures in that. When we look at just Texas alone, we've lost 2.2 million acres of our working lands since 1997. We've lost 1.5 million in the last 5 years. And so you think of that conversion rate, right? So we do some quick math, rate basically close to 1.5 million. We're losing around 1,300 acres a day. And we think of then the pressures of our population increase in Texas is around 1,300 people daily. So when you add that combination, it's a deadly combination. I always say, Peter, unfortunately, Texas is winning this race across all of the states in the U.S. It's a race I wish we weren't winning, but we have to come up with solutions. And I think the first part of that is really education and understanding the responsibility that we all have in play on some of the things that you mentioned of, if we are expanding and we need to build and all those things, we need all that, right? We need the economic sustainability of our city's forces, but there's a right way to do that. And some of that is actually looking at where's the proper lands, can we develop in, maybe not as productive of a agricultural productive lands, and how do we start doing that and looking at it? And, unfortunately, when we think of some of our subdivisions, they're everybody wants a little bit bigger yard of, 1 acre, 5 acres, but then all of a sudden we're tying up a lot of those properties that hurts us in the long run as well.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the permeability and infiltration rate on asphalt and concrete is not that great. And
It
so
is
now
not good.
it influences watershed behavior
Yes.
to a great degree, as we've discovered, unfortunately, in a couple instances recently. So we've run into each other over the years in a number of situations.
Hmm.
Um, and one of them was a conversation about sustainable beef, which where we met, I think, at that one time was a global uh, effort to bring people from across the realm, and the world. I
Sure.
do remember you being on a panel with a gentleman from Alberta and somebody from
Hmm.
Ireland and somebody
Yeah.
from Southern Africa,
Yeah.
which, yeah, cattle everywhere. But too many people hear the word sustainability, and
Hmm.
I flippantly have said that too often those conversations are really about sustainababble. We're putting a label on something, so we don't really
Hmm.
understand it. We feel better about it. And unfortunately, some people are against it, knee jerk reaction. Some people are for it, knee jerk reaction. And there's just not a lot of understanding in the middle. So if we could spend a little time exploring the components that have to be part of any realistic conversation about, in this case, sustainable beef,
Hmm.
and then we can sort of develop through there.
Yeah. No, I think I mean, it's a great point. I think, there's probably, we could look and there's probably 1,000 different definitions of what sustainability is, right? And unfortunately, that's where it makes it a little messy. And then, I think, we're seeing more and more of a movement, which I'm extremely excited about. It's kind of this regenerative agriculture, right? And you have those folks that are really thinking about that, sustainability just means to sustain where you're at, right? It's status quo in essence, and it's the aspect of regenerative. It's actually growing, and I guess I have always agreed with that 100%. And I've always looked at though sustainability and kind of my definition is about being better tomorrow than you are today, right? It's a journey, not a destination. And it really is based around those kind of the three legs, right? The economics, the environmental, and the social piece. And it's not just one leg; it's about all three and the connectivity of all three. And it's more of a systems approach and looking at all of that holistically. So I think, in essence, we can put the word aside and just come to, what is our mission and where do we want to be? And I guarantee you will have agreement, 9 out of 10 times, right? There's always going to be the one person that's never going to agree. And you can't worry about that person. You got to, let's all come together and keep moving forward. So I think that's how we start the conversation in my mind, about that.
And it's the struggle is to find those objective measures, and then of
Mhm.
whatever segment we're focusing on. There
Right.
has to be something that allows a manager to manage towards goals. There has to be something for the rest of society to understand these are the measurable outcomes. Um, and I'm a little concerned in some quarters. I hear conversations that go along the lines of producers ought to be rewarded for our practices, but we can't measure the outcomes. And that gets a little too
Yeah.
squishy for my comfort zone. There has to be some way, whether it's soil quality, whether it's measuring sedimentation in surface waters, whether it's some assessment of efficiency. So getting
Yep.
at emissions, there's got to be something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just engaged in more of a feelings conversation. And
I agree with you. Really, it's, I wake up each and every day wanting to empower the next producer, right? That's my passion. And we don't know where we're going if we don't know where we are, right? And so it takes measurement and really thinking about those outcomes, outcome based, is important. And we have to set those not only individually, but I think, it needs to stack across the value chain and across, a bigger group of us from a producer perspective. So I agree 100% with you. I think we just have to come to agreement what that is. And I think today we're getting closer and closer to that. I think one is technology helps. We have the ability where I think technology will help us be able to measure some of these outcomes quicker and easier and cheaper. And that's what's going to really drive change. But I think we have to think about it from a, I'll put my producer hat on. We can't measure 100 things, right? We don't have enough, enough daylight in the day to do our business and then measure those things. But what are the key 5 things? What are the key 6 things that really make a difference and that we really should be striving towards? And so that's what we need to focus. And I think that's where we need some of our research to help us, really kind of help define what are those kind of key things to move us forward.
So I would imagine that the majority of people listening still at this point are not coming from an agricultural background, but that's the public. The vast majority of the American public today are not. Where are there resources or organizations, one, that you would recommend for people to just learn more? And 2, if they wanted to get involved, if there are efforts and organizations that are doing work on the ground, you should pardon the expression, that people from non-agriculture communities are welcome to join in and participate and learn more by that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a difficult one because there's a lot of work out there, and where do you start, and how do you kind of wrap your head and arms around, some of this. But I think some of it is just starting to listen to conversations like this, and that we're having. I think is one good way to just hear other, organizations and other thoughts, and kind of start digging through that. Like you and many others, and probably all of your listeners, is we all wear many hats. And, as myself, I wear, many hats, and, as the CEO of TALTS and the chairman of the National Grazing Land Coalition, I think is a great organization of really, it's about, it's a producer-led organization, but it's the same time we're trying to show the benefits of the stewardship of our grazing lands and what it means to everyone. And so it's a good resource to kind of understand that side of the business. The U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which we've talked a little bit about, is really looking at the full value chain of beef sustainability. And there's a lot of good information through that organization, and ways that you can, participate and listen to, some different meetings and conversations there. I think some of the aspects of talking about these land trends and components of that, there's Texas Land Trends has its own website and information and dialogue, which is really great. And I try to encourage everybody to go there to understand, the big why, and this big, issue that we have coming ahead of us, and where we all, have some responsibility, and how we all can help in this fragmentation and these components. It's with Texas A&M. And then I think too, I think American Farmland Trust is another great resource, Peter. They have some good studies called Farms Under Threat is a new study, which is looking at land trends across the U.S., not just Texas. And it puts some dialogue of, one is the fragmentation, but also looking at the policy within the state, and have some scorecards and some other pieces. It's another great resource to kind of look at some areas on that as well.
And we could also add land grant universities, cooperative
Yep.
extension service. We could also add the NRCS for landowners.
Correct. Yes, sir.
A lot of information and technical information for people to learn more about the land that they might own. So there's lots of resources available to people. Encourage people to find those. So if you had the chance to talk to the 98% of Americans that aren't involved in agriculture directly, I mean, is production agriculture, is there something that you'd like them to hear beyond what you've already said in terms of a message from the people that you've worked with and for that are on the land and providing the services and the food and fiber?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Peter. I think, the things that pop in my mind is, soil and water conservation starts where the first raindrop falls. And we kind of break that down. And that was actually LBJ kind of brought that statement in the early 40s, in the sense of, when we think about where that raindrop goes and it hits the ground, a lot of that is hitting on our grazing lands, right? Our grazing lands that provide this ruminant aspect of herding and brings basically a great red protein and things. But those lands, we can't go in and really eat grass ourselves and things of that nature that those provide, but they're so valuable, not only from that high quality protein that feeds us, but also this, our clean water and clean air and all these ecosystem services that are provided. And, it really starts with the land stewards of those lands. And those are private landowners. Those are also some of our public land managers that are managing these lands. And so it's all important and it's all inclusive. When we need to support, those individuals from that perspective of buying products, understanding, just telling them how much we do appreciate them. And, I think that's some of our lives are busy and we don't really tell our farmers and ranchers we appreciate all the hard work and sacrifices that they do to provide to our families in many, many ways.
Yeah, and I think the last few months our worlds have gotten a little smaller. And one thought that occurs to me is people may not understand fully the role of grazing animals in maintaining the health and productivity of grasslands. That they look at it somehow as a negative to graze, when in fact, if we don't, they degenerate.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, when we just look about our grasslands across the world, not just the U.S., but there's ecological processes that are happening each and every day, right? Our grasses are these, green open solar panels that are taking this energy from the sun and bringing that back in, back in through the roots into the soil. There's this, energy cycle. There's mineral cycles. There's, water cycles. There's all these ecological processes across our landscape to keep them healthy. And, our landscapes were, developed way before us with grazing animals. And so the grazing component is needed to keep those processes in place. I say grazing and fire. And so we overlook that. And unfortunately, we've put fences and we've, we live in a different world, but we can't, move beyond and forget about the proper way of managing those landscapes and what those landscapes provide us. And so it's really important for us to understand in the community. And as you mentioned, cities kind of expanding, into some of our farm and ranching communities that put pressure on those farmers and ranchers. We need to understand that and understand, and respect of their processes of that stewardship, and understand, fire is a good example, and there's a culture that has to go beyond just the farmers and ranchers, but to the full community to appreciate and understand that. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more wildfires and things, across the landscape because we've taken some of those tools out of the landscape. So it's ecology is messy, and it's complex.
Ecology is messy. There's the tag. I do remember also a story that I got from a physician in Montana that basically, the end of that story is cows come first. That he had a patient that was refusing admission to the hospital because he had to take care of the cows that night. He'd be back in the morning. He'd make arrangements for people to take care of his cows, but he hadn't done that. And so they needed him. The animals depend on him. And that kind of a mindset, I also think, isn't well appreciated.
No.
And so this, and the other thing that strikes me as something I don't know, and that is the thought of walking across a piece of land that your grandfather or your great grandfather walked across, and the idea that people would knowingly degrade that,
right,
is it's hard for me to make those two things line up. Now, when we know better, hopefully we do better, and we're learning more as we go along. So those are a couple. They're not universal across the farming community. I mean, there are differences, and not. There is the joke about the only way you get into agriculture is you marry into it or you inherit it.
Yeah.
Some truth, but there are other ways, and so you have, like you say, very different people involved, but some of those things do kind of frequently show up.
No, you're right. So I mean, I think unfortunately, the dynamics of people are different, and what makes us different. Unfortunately, we have some people that look at land as a commodity, right? It's sort of kind of like you mentioned, is you overuse it, you kind of abuse it, those type of things that we can get more, and then you have some that when we look at land as a community, it changes, right? And we understand the dynamics of how it's goes. Actually, kind of the tagline I use is beyond the fence line, right? That land actually provides for our families but it also provides, beyond the fence line to downstream to the community of all of these factors we've talked about of, food and water and open space and all of those things. So, again, it's about that land ethic and that stewardship ethic that we have.
Well, and because so few people are so productive in the sense of their food production for the rest of society, we don't have to have the agrarian-based society that we had 200 years ago or 120 years ago, whatever time frame we want to look at. And it would be hoped that then the people that are freed from having to do that work to feed themselves on a 24-hour-a-day basis can do other work that contributes to the betterment of society. And so you've had this specialization and separation, and hopefully it leads to advancement. I do think about the contrast between, say, agriculture pre-World War I and agriculture now, wherein we were still at the beginning of the 20th century, we weren't doing a good job of replacing nutrients. We hadn't really become conscious of soil erosion. What we were doing was we were depleting land and then moving on.
Correct.
And certainly that drove a lot of westward movement from colonial times through Civil War times. And so people have an idea of what it once was, and it tends to be very romantic and frequently gets confused with what they think it ought to be today without understanding some of the nittier, grittier aspects of it.
No, I think it's a good point, and I think there's that romantic, aspect of what land is. I think when we think about it, we think of, what is it? I think of the painting of what do they call it? The extinction agent, right?
Hmm.
If you remember that Rockefeller old painting
Rockwell.
of Rockwell, a painting where you have the extinction agent kind of sitting there over the little blonde girl with her 4-H book, right? And there's chickens and horses and the family all around it. And that's, when we think about it, I think in some sense we have this disconnect, and that's what we think how agriculture should be. And then it's this, and unfortunately, with technologies and things and the dire need of being able to feed, this increasing population, agriculture looks different today, and it needs to be able to sustain our population, as well as taking care of the land and all of those things. And I think we just have to bridge and have a better communication. I think, unfortunately, we're really good about talking to ourselves or to our peers, and we keep our conversations to our peers because that's what's comfortable to us. That's, who we can relate to. And I think we all need to do a little better job of, stepping outside of our, comfort zone and talking, to other peers and having these dialogues in a productive manner.
Absolutely. The little red barn
Yes.
is a cliche, and I was thinking just earlier today, growing up in Pennsylvania, the great big old barns, those were actually machines. They were designed for a time, for functions. They no longer fit. They actually, if you can take the romance out of them, they weren't an efficient use of resources. When you look at the wood marvel at the workmanship, but when you look at the amount of wood to build that barn,
Right.
as opposed to materials that are available today. And I do admit it's sad to drive across rural America and see the remnants of the farmsteads, and all that represents. I hope that a significant amount of that represents the opportunity for subsequent generations to advance and maybe go off to college and maybe acquire education and employment opportunities that wouldn't have existed for them back on that subsistence level farm.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Peter. And I think one we overlook, and one thing that I appreciated my time with the Noble Foundation is the promotion of agriculture and science of agriculture and STEM. We would have thousands and thousands of students that came through the foundation every year. And, I think your point is well taken, in that we can still be part of the solution and come up with solutions and help the dynamics and still be part of agriculture. We don't have to sit behind a tractor or, own a farm or a ranch. There's lots of places for our youth and our future generations to play a role, and a crucial role of, keeping food on the table and keeping our landscapes healthy.
And I continue to advocate for people to cast their eyes overseas, because there's a tremendous need around the world to allow for the flourishing of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. So I've been asking you a bunch of questions. It's only fair to let you turn the tables if you'd like to.
Sure. No, I appreciate it, Peter, and I've always appreciated over the years, us having these conversations, and it's great. I'm excited of you starting your podcast to be able to share these conversations, to a broader group, and so it's exciting to me. I guess one of the questions, that I have, and I know we've talked about it in the past, is, what are I would say from your perspective, what are the top three challenges that we face in the next 5 years from your perspective?
Good question. I am concerned about the role of interest groups in opposing animal source food consumption and production. And I'm concerned that they will have louder voices in the next few years unless we get better at putting out. We don't necessarily have to argue back, but just communicate so that people have access to all the information. Closely tied to that is the message that says the production, well, it's part of it, the production of animal source food is inherently damaging to the environment and damaging to a degree that other forms of food production are not. I think that has the potential to very quickly manifest itself in policy that will harm especially ruminant animal agriculture. And again, I think there's lots of research available. We got to get better at communicating that to the rest. I'm of mixed emotions about the whole analog market for the faux products, and it's really it's an interesting topic because so many of the arguments in their favor really don't have merit. Health claims, environmental claims, nutritional claims, none of them really stand up to good scrutiny. Now, if somebody wants to eat them, fine. I mean, it's America. I understand marketing. And I don't know how much that will ever really be a threat. Although there are people who have very candidly said that they want to eliminate animal agriculture by 2030, 2035, whatever the number is. So, and these people have a voice and they have funding, and so they need to be taken at their word. If somebody says they want to destroy you, take them serious, I think. So those are some of the things. You said the next 5 years. Unfortunately, I see the dietary guidelines not shifting in the United States, which means that all of the policies that have to align themselves with the dietary policies aren't going to shift. I argue, among many other people, argue that those dietary policies need to shift. And I also try to make people aware of just how much those dietary policies influence agricultural policies. And so that's a concern. In 5 years, will we be facing a new reality as far as the people that process and therefore the next round of dietary guidelines? Meanwhile, we've got the vast majority of adult Americans are no longer healthy, metabolically speaking. That's where we've gotten to. So I'm concerned about our agricultural communities where so many of these are multi-generation sort of operations, and that becomes an issue. Rural healthcare. Our healthcare system is not sustainable. And so, again, I mentioned earlier, I want that to be brought into the conversation in some way. Many very sincere people who are in that space explicitly bring along the received wisdom of dietary advice. And I even see that in the sustainability space within the beef industry. I hope that over the next 5 years, we can get more people to internalize the information that's coming out of the research and clinical experience of researchers and physicians and other who are working in that space. And again, I think it's really, really, really good news. It's the best news I can imagine, that we can address all of these issues by following one course. And unfortunately, the bad news is if we follow the current course, I don't see us getting there.
Mm-hmm. No, those are all great points and all huge challenges, and enough work ahead of us for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh yeah.
And it's not any one of us, and it's bigger than any one of us, and it's probably bigger than us.
Yeah, I think that's the point that I was going to make too, Peter, is that the connectivity of how, what I would say, soil health, land health, human health, connective, they're all connected.
Mm-hmm.
And it's and it's hard to wrap your head around that. It's hard to wrap your head around just one of those components and knowing that they're all connected. And so it's going to take a lot of us kind of pulling on the same rope in the same direction, for sure.
Yeah, well, like you said, ecology is messy.
That's right.
and yes, there are a lot of us, and we need more. But it is all across the world, there are people who are working in these sorts of fields. And we're better at like you said, we're better at talking within our discipline or within our tribe than we are outside. But we need to get past that. And maybe one of the things that'll come out of 2020 is things like this. Just more people learning that there are these other sources, and there's information available, and there are people doing work that we didn't know about before. And so hopefully down the road that will bear fruit.
I think it will. I think there's, I'm always a glass half full, right? And there's a lot of silver linings I think 2020 will bring. And I think some of that's exactly what you said. So,
well, and as somebody pointed out to me, the glass is refillable.
That's right.
Yeah. And we're dealing with, when we're dealing with ruminant animal agriculture, and I know that you're dealing with, in Texas Agricultural Land Trust, you're dealing with all agricultural land. I shouldn't be, so myopic that I'm on, but again, it's not either or. Livestock, cropping, it's all integrated.
Correct.
Just looks a little different. But with the ruminant animal agriculture, we're closest to being these systems that can operate using appropriate levels of inputs from land that can't provide human edible food in a way that doesn't just maintain, but it can actually enhance the environment for wildlife, for society. Yeah. So I consider that really good news.
That is good news.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. Thank you for what you've been doing. I look forward to the next time that we can get together and at an actual meeting. And
that'd be great. It'd be great to catch up again and face to face, and maybe hopefully before then. But our National Grazing Lands Coalition conference is coming up this coming December in Myrtle Beach, and that'd be a great place to meet and hopefully have you speak again at that conference, and love to have you, and hopefully we'll see each other way before December, fingers crossed. And maybe I would also like to invite you to my podcast, Beyond the Fence Line, that we host and have this same kind of conversation as well. So thank you again, Peter, for the invite and more importantly, the conversation.
It's my pleasure. I'd be happy to, and I already have my plans about Myrtle Beach. So
great.
yeah. So good health, and until then, take care.
Thank you.